Hello, and welcome to a special edition of an interview for the Formula E Zone YouTube channel. My name is Ed Hunter, and this weekend, the coming weekend rather, the London E-Prix returns for the first time in 5 years with an exciting indoor-outdoor layout at the Excel Centre in Newham's Royal Docks. It's the first time that Formula E has raced in its home city since 2016, when the event took place for the final time at Battersea Park in Wandsworth. For Formula E fans, the London E-Prix in Battersea conjures up fond memories of dramatic, incredibly close title deciders, but local residents had a very different experience. For 2 years, the Battersea Park Action Group campaigned against the park being used for the race, eventually agreeing a deal with Formula E in order to prevent legal action on the condition that Formula E never again returned to the park. I was a university student at the time, reporting on the story, as well as contributing to the group's public meetings, so I got to know the members of BPAG, or Battersea Park Action Group, very well. With me now is Paul Ekins OBE, Susan Lofthouse, and Laurence Percival. How are you doing, guys?
Very well. Nice to be invited here. Thank you.
That's great to hear. What about you, Laurence?
I'm good. Looking forward to talking about it.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so what I wanted to start with, bring us up to modern day, of course, was a little quote I read at the end of last year when we all thought the London E-Prix was going to happen at Excel in 2020, and obviously we all know why they ended up getting delayed, but Formula E were asked by one of the councillors if they'd learnt their lesson after opposition from people. I mean, I assume that means Battersea Park Action Group saw it not return to racing Battersea, and the quote from a press officer at Formula E was, "We learnt a lot from that experience and racing in other cities. Planning racing in a park was not an ideal scenario. We decided it wasn't the right place or space for Formula E to grow. The only place it can work is somewhere like XL." And I think that's something that, moving to XL, was something that all of us, actually, I was kind of involved in calling for it. We all sort of campaigned for it as a sort of solution. And now, finally, it's going ahead. And I think that's in no small part down to all the hard work you did to move it out of Battersea. Do you guys feel any sense of satisfaction that the race is finally in the right place? Susan, first of all, do you agree on that?
I do. I seem to remember right at the beginning we were saying that although the park is very beautiful, it really wasn't the right place. The right place would be something far more futuristic, such as what we've got further down the river, which would underline the exciting nature of electric cars.
My feeling was very much the same about that. We had nothing against Formula E any more than we have anything against Formula One down at Silverstone. But Battersea Park is a grade 2 star listed park. It's a Victorian carriageway. In order to race around it, you had to turn it into a construction site for about 3 weeks before the race, just at the time everyone was wanting to enjoy it as a park. And then you had a similar time afterwards where all the great slabs of concrete were taken away. So it was clearly not the right place, and we suggested it should go to XL at the time. And I think those arguments had carried weight with Formula E, and ultimately I'm delighted that that's what they decided to do.
Definitely. I mean, that was very succinctly put. I mean, my objection when it happened was purely visceral. I mean, Paul and Susan have campaigned about many subjects over the years, but I was a newbie, I was a virgin. It's my first ever piece of activism. But I was absolutely stunned when I saw a tiny little notice, a few months in the middle of winter, a few months before the first race, and then when I looked into it online, I was stunned that they were going to concrete up the park for a month. I literally couldn't believe it. And to get someone like me, an advertising man with a completely zero background in activism, to come and get involved, I felt about it really strongly. And I'm really glad we got the result, because I think there were periods where we had some very dark days when we thought the race would be there for 5 or 6 years. So it was a very good act.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's introduce you guys in a bit more detail, starting, I think, with you, Paul. You're a hugely respected, hugely accomplished academic, I think it's fair to say, with a wealth of experience in environmental issues, politics. So I think a lot of people in the meetings, I think, agreed that you were a great choice to play a pivotal role chairing those meetings. And for those watching who might be unfamiliar, could you describe the leadership structure of Battersea Park Action Group and how you got involved?
Yeah, it's not much to describe really, in the sense that there weren't many of us on the organising group. We called ourselves the G7, G8, G9, G10, depending on how many of us were there and were being active at the time. We built up, obviously, quite a formidable social media presence, largely thanks to Laurence, who knows how these things work. And we built up quite a large email list of supporters who were prepared to make donations. And we kept them in touch. That was largely due to Susan's secretaryship. And I've got a lot of experience chairing meetings, so I was perfectly happy to chair the meetings, but I was by no means the most active of the group in terms of actually doing the hard work. And it was a very flat structure. People came when they had the time to our group meetings. We divided out the tasks that needed to be done. People who had the time did those tasks, and we went away and set the date of the next meeting, by which time those tasks would have been done. So that's how it worked. But obviously, as with all such campaigns, most of the activity took place between the meetings. And that was really how we managed to build the campaign into something effective.
What Paul is being very modest about this. We had about 100 people at the first meeting, and we got them by leafleting hundreds of houses because nobody knew what was going on. There was supposed to have been 2,000 letters gone out. Nobody had any. And when people found out what was going on, they came to the meeting. And apart from us running it, chairing it, producing minutes, newsletters, wonderful website, films, interviews, we let people do their own thing. And we had 597 individual letters, not forgetting letters from people like Open Spaces, Parks and Gardens, Friends of the Earth. People were amazing. There were the skills in that group of hundreds of people. There were health and safety, there was filmmakers, there were economists, advertising people. It was a united front. I had to take my hat off to all these people.
I would agree on that completely. And one of the things that really impressed me is how the group really, as time went on, they were already pretty good when I first went into your public meetings. Really, you guys really got ahead of the game, really, in terms of emailing sponsors, for instance, and getting them to trying to get them to respond about issues that were going on behind the scenes that you guys knew about. And could you tell us a little bit more about how well the group organized, especially as time went on?
We decided quite early on that although our argument was not really with Formula E, it was with Wandsworth Council for allowing the race in a completely inappropriate place. It was quite clear that Wandsworth Council had its eye on the money and was not going to budge. We did everything we possibly could in a local democratic way with, as Susan has said, organising letters, petitions, turning up to council meetings, making our argument, but they were besotted with the amount of money they were getting for the race. And it was clear that they were not going to listen to the local people at all. So we did turn our attention to Formula E, and we had a much better reception from Formula E. They talked to us. And it was clear that they genuinely believed, and they were selling this event as a green event. And of course, I mean, I'm fully in favor of electric vehicles in the right place. And we had no problem with that. It was in Battersea Park. So we talked to Formula E, and it was clear that the sponsors also believed it was a green event. And the sponsors had no idea that they were actually screwing up one of London's iconic green spaces. So we turned our attention to them and made sure that they became aware of that. And obviously under those circumstances, they didn't want to be associated with the event, which was turning out not to be green at all, and which was turning out to be seriously disruptive to the local community. One might have hoped that the Wandsworth Council would have taken some notice of that. But as I say, they didn't. And it was left to Formula E to arrive at an arrangement with us whereby they said they wouldn't come back to Battersea. And I'm still enormously grateful to them for that, because it should have been Wandsworth Council that listened to its local residents, but it wasn't. It was Formula E. And I was really, as I say, I was really grateful for that.
I want to bring Laurence in now on the social media side and the website, of course. Because I remember the website had this section, what was it called? The Hall of Shame, I think it was called, where you'd list usually it'd be businessmen and politicians who had a role in bringing about the London E-Prix and had some level of responsibility. How did you approach framing the narrative, Laurence? Did you go for sort of David versus Goliath? Was that the model you were working on? That it was the little people against the big corporations?
In my mind, it was simple, old-fashioned good versus evil. But I suppose that's not really true. But I think, I mean, the Hall of Shame, I have to invoke Susan on that, because she was quite instrumental in that. But we were blunt. I mean, we really were very direct. And I think what Paul just said, the shift in terms of how the campaign was organised and where it succeeded, there was a sort of a darkest hour when we'd been hammering the council and we weren't getting anywhere. I remember having a cup of tea one night with the other sort of leaders of the protest, and we were all very down. And it was almost the next thing we did was that we realised that we had to shift it to the sponsors and to Formula E. And it was then, and it actually all happened quite near the end of the campaign, it was then that it really moved. And I think what we tried to do was to show on social media and in the website, and how much we love the park. So when you first went on the website, it's set up immediately what a wonderful park it is. You know, the grade is a grade 2 listing that it has. The fact that it's recognisable. You know, the fathers and mothers of the park could come Victorian times, come and visit the park now, and they'd recognise it, which is unbelievable. And you know, we tried to get across how much we loved it, and thereby our horror at what they'd done. And I think one thing we used a lot was photography, and we had a lot of different people who took photographs of, you know, huge fortifications of concrete and metal pylons. And it was awful. When you actually put the gallery of images together, it was shocking. It was shocking what was done to our park. And the first year that the race actually happened, I mean, walking around as they were setting up, and there were these lorries queued up coming into the park, belching out diesel. It was dreadful. It was absolutely dreadful. And that sort of visceral anger, which wasn't just mine, it was everybody's. It was in the meetings, you could feel it from the floor, it was on the website, it was in social, it was in the film that a leading documentary film director made for us. Everything carried that sort of visceral hate of what was having a love for the park, but also a hate of what was being done. And I think, you know, by communicating our shock to the sponsors, in the end, that's why we prevailed.
Could I add something to that? I think Laurence made a very poetic presentation there. I think he was absolutely right. And I can't help feeling that we would never have got to that point where Formula E came to the park without our dear friend Boris Johnson, who sent his friend Eddie Lister, who had been head of council at one point, and said, "Oh, this is wonderful, you can come put it in the park." And of course, Alejandro, his kids played football there. Of course, it was a lovely idea, but he never thought it through. And I suspect very much that Lister and Johnson just told him it would be all right. It'll be all right on a night. It will be beautiful. And I'm afraid Johnson's got a lot to answer for. A lot.
I absolutely agree. And it was very interesting how I thought the minute that Battersea Park Action Group started getting involved, started mobilising, Boris Johnson mysteriously went a bit quiet. He did have the show run, I think, on the Friday before one race. But then we mysteriously never heard from Mr. Johnson again. I do wonder what happened to that man. The next question I wanted to ask you guys was about Wandsworth Council, and about, because you guys have mentioned this a little bit already, I'm interested how you all found out about the 5-year deal that had been done and sort of when exactly, because I know Laurence mentioned the end of 2014. There are a couple of people who've learned at the beginning of 2015. I mean, John Fox memorably told me that he found out when the diggers and the construction vehicles arrived, basically to add a bit of tarmac to where one of the chicanes was going to be at the south end of the park, I think. And it felt like there was a lot of bureaucracy that was set up almost deliberately so that people didn't know what was going to happen until it was too late. Would you guys agree with that?
Definitely.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, Paul, everybody will tell you that was in our group that later on in the campaign, let's say round about the first Formula E, we found a lot of stuff on motoring magazines and other journals back in August of 2014 saying what was going to happen and how Johnson was saying the air would be electric. And yet nobody in Wandsworth, apart from a few councillors, knew anything about it.
Yes, and when obviously we got into discussions with the council, they claimed, as Susan said, that they had sent out 2,000 letters to local residents. We could not find a single resident anywhere around the park, and we lived within 20 meters of it. We could not find a resident anywhere who had received one of these letters. So either these letters were not sent, or they were given to someone who put them in the nearest bin, because they were definitely not received by local residents. And had they been received, and had we then had any kind of idea that the park would be turned effectively into a construction site for the best part of the summer, we would obviously have started campaigning much earlier. But the first thing we were really aware of was the arrival of diggers. We then had the public meeting that Susan referred to, and we got the campaign going from there. But the so-called consultation with local residents was completely non-existent.
I agree, Paul. There was so much of the council story that didn't really add up, and it seemed quite transparent that they were not being 100% honest with people.
Yeah, I mean that's, I mean, Paul's already said, but you know, I didn't get that letter. I live in one of the Chelsea Bridge Wharf, which is a huge development of flats by the river, also right by the park. And I know loads of people here. And as soon as I found out about Formula E, I questioned loads of other apartment residents here, and not one single person received the invitation to the consultation. The consultation, I read the minutes of it, and it just sounded like there was no opposition at all. It was just sort of sugar-coated and passed through. And it was only then that we began to find out about it and then did something. So, you know, untruths, I'm not sure there are any, I'm not sure about untruths. I think it's just lack of information, lack of consultation. I don't know, Paul, Susan, would you say there were untruths?
Well, I mean, I can't say whether they actually sent out the letters or not. They said they had sent them out, but it's a bit odd if you send out 2,000 letters. I mean, all of us living in Wandsworth, we receive numerous letters from Wandsworth Council about this and that. It seems a little bit of a coincidence that no one we could find had received any of these letters. We couldn't even find a copy to find out what it had said. And yet they said they'd sent them out. Now, I mean, obviously, we can't prove that they didn't send them out, but you have to draw your own conclusions.
Well, there was at the November meeting 2015 in the town hall, and Ed was there. It was actually said by one of the council officers when another officer asked, or councillor asked why nobody had one of these letters. Oh, well, a lot of them are mansion blocks and they're notoriously difficult to access, which begs the question, how do the posties manage? That was their excuse. They weren't going to say, no, we didn't send them. And I think there were copies online somewhere. We didn't get one. We don't know anybody that did.
And we don't live in a mansion block. We lived in a terraced house with its own front door. So there were obviously no problems with that. And no one in our street, which is one of the streets adjoining the park, no one in our street got one of these letters that we could find out.
You know, the council didn't tell untruths, but what they didn't seem to do, they didn't seem to want to entertain any kind of criticism of Formula E. If you said, actually, this event isn't green, which we did many times, because it's concreting up the park, you're losing the park from, I mean, you can quibble the amount of time, but basically a month at the height of summer in a very populous, you know, multicultural, very broad demographic in terms of ages. You're taking away the park, you're damaging people's mental health. I mean, some of the, I wish I could call them up now, but I can't. Some of the, you know, responses we had, people just answering, answering us on social media and saying how appalled they were, how their mental health was being affected by the construction going on. And it's like, when you talk to the council, it's like, you might as well have been talking in, you know, Sanskrit or some ancient language. They just didn't entertain. There could be any criticism. I remember talking to, trying to talk to one of the councillors about the fact that the annual conference of Formula E was held in Monte Carlo, where you know, the petro billionaires park their yachts, but they're basically ships up against the dock, and Leonardo DiCaprio holds court there, who's the chairman of the Formula E sort of committee. And I said, how ridiculous that is. How ungreen is that? The most ungreen place you can think of, probably in the Western world. And they have their annual meeting there. I mean, it's ludicrous. Yeah. They wound up 5 years later.
I wanted to ask when one of the councillors
decided to sneak in unannounced to one of the public meetings, and I remember it being this quite fractious scenario.
But I heard it was quite fractious in this specific councillor being voted out of the meeting. What was that like? Could you describe that for us?
Well, what happened was she came in and sat at the back of the meeting with a clipboard. Now, everybody has a right to come in because we started those meetings with members of the public. But the correct thing to do, and she had not been at all helpful in anything, would be to come up and introduce herself, in which case people would have said, oh, welcome, here's Councillor X, welcome. But she didn't, she sat at the back. And somebody noticed and said something to the chair, and people were so annoyed with this person that they had a vote, and people said she should be asked to leave. And she said, oh, well, I'm not here for political, now I've let out her sex, but anyway, there are about 50 of them. I'm not here for political reasons. But I'm afraid she was, because she hadn't listened to any of the concerns of her ward members. So she was asked politely to leave.
Yeah, and it did sort of illustrate how the relationship between the council and Battersea Park Action Group had kind of
completely fallen apart by that point.
But yeah, I just remember it being a very interesting turn in the story.
Okay, shall we talk a little bit about some of the coverage that Battersea Park Action Group experienced?
Unfortunately, there was a lot of coverage, a little less charitable, I think might be the way of putting it. And I know, Paul, there was a particularly scathing article you did an interview with the Times, didn't you? That was quite, not very nice thing to read, to be honest. So I just want to ask, because there was a lot of criticism of the group from a few different areas, and how do you guys deal with that? Because it can be quite disheartening.
Well, I'll come back on that first. Yeah, I mean, there was this article in the Times where it was clear that the journalist had a particular take on it, and he interviewed the councillor from Wandsworth Council as well as me, the main councillor who was in charge of these sorts of things. And that councillor took it upon himself basically to say that I was only interested in this because it was Battersea Park and I lived there, and I wouldn't care whether it was going on somewhere else in London, which of course is complete nonsense. I've spent 40 years of my life trying to protect the environment globally, locally, everywhere. So the fact that obviously it was Battersea meant that it was local to me. But I've always thought that the so-called NIMBYs, not in my backyards, they get a bad name because if you're, quite unfairly, they get a bad name because if you're not prepared to protect your local environment, what on earth are you prepared to protect? And what I resented from the article was that there was a very clear insinuation that if the Formula E went to some other green space, I would be very happy and I wouldn't care as long as it wasn't in my backyard. And that's complete nonsense, because our position all the way along was it doesn't belong in any of London's green spaces. And we were very clear in our interactions with other green groups in London, other friends of green spaces in London, that this was our position. So obviously the councillor concerned was keen to try to score some cheap points. Whether he succeeded or not, I don't know from his readership, but obviously it was complete nonsense, as I've got a multi-decade track record of trying to protect the environment all over the place. Yeah, well, I mean, the standard accusation from people like Wandsworth Council to people like us is that we're selfish, we're NIMBYs, we don't like other people enjoying themselves, and that we just want to get rid of this and we don't care where else it goes. As I say, that was complete nonsense. And our arguments were always based, as I think Laurence has said, in terms of the park being a very special place in a very populous city for people who want a bit of peace and quiet and tranquility, a little bit of interaction with nature, which you can't exactly get everywhere in London. And just how important that is has been proved over this last year with the pandemic, where green space has been an absolute lifeline for people. And so those were the arguments that we were making. And they fell on absolutely deaf ears as far as Wandsworth Council was concerned. All they were saying was that these are selfish guys who want to keep the park for themselves and they don't want anybody else to have any fun in it. And as I say, that's complete nonsense. It's what kind of fun you have there. And Wandsworth Council has a 30-year track record now of trying to commercialize the park and turning it into a money spinner for itself, which is not what the founding fathers of the park intended. They intended it to be a place for relaxation and pleasure of a nature-based kind of variety. There's plenty of places in London you can go and have noise and fun and activity, but the park should be a place for peace and tranquility. And we tried to make that point, but as I say, it fell on deaf ears.
So I was wondering if I could ask you about some of the there's the kind of lingering frustration, I think, from Formula E fans that feel that, oh, it's only those the sort of, you get these quite rude comments about like referring to, and like Paul was saying, it's the NIMBY tag, which I always feel like the ideal counter to the NIMBY tag is NAMBY, which is not against my business or interest, which I thought was a good little revisit to that I found mainly through searching for it online. Admittedly, didn't come up with it myself. Does it annoy you guys whenever you see Formula E fans write the odd comment blaming you guys? Because it feels to me like that Battersea Park Action Group gets all of the blame for everything going wrong in Battersea, but none of the credit for not only resolving the situation, but for obviously the fact that because we moved it from Battersea, it allows it to go to Excel, of course, which in my view, and hopefully the race will bear this out, is a much better venue. Susan, Laurence, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that we were mildly irritated, especially when they got facts wrong. But everybody has the right to their opinion. It was our park after all. It didn't upset me, irritated me a bit. What irritated me more was the council and the council's fibs and obfuscations, because they knew the truth. And it goes on with this council, so it's nothing new. But I wouldn't blame the fans. You know, they're not always told the truth. And they like the idea of this thing being in the park, but it wasn't the right place.
I'm happy to add one more thing. I mean, one of the things that has certainly happened since the Formula E campaign is that groups like Battersea Park Action Group have mushroomed all over London. And there is now a London Friends of Green Spaces network that is much more active and influential than it was. And it brings together, it coordinates all the groups that are seeking to protect their local green spaces, because what happened in Battersea Park is by no means unique. Lots of different councils around London are essentially trying to turn their green spaces into commercial spaces, which very often degrades the natural space. There's noise, there's litter, there are huge crowds, and simply deprives Londoners of that feeling of able to get some peace with nature, which is so important for people, and which the parks were created in order for people to be able to experience. And one of the things that has definitely happened since 2015 is that local people everywhere in London have become much more vociferous in protecting their park than was the case then. I mean, I remember that our own Friends of Battersea Park, which is an organization that was supposed to be protecting it, gave us practically no support at all, which is why we set up an alternative action group in order to campaign against this. And I think there has been a greater surge of awareness over the last few years that these green spaces are really special places that need to be kept as green spaces for people to engage in informal family-based relaxation rather than loud and organized commercial events, of which Formula E was a particular egregious example.
Well, that's great to hear about the legacy that the group's had on London as a whole, because I think that often doesn't get talked about very much. So thanks for telling us that, Paul.
What were your views on Alejandro Agag, both before and after you met him? Because obviously he's a very interesting character. Obviously he's a very successful businessman, and all of you would have met him during the negotiations towards the end. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on him.
Well, I would say that he's a businessman, as you say. He likes gimmicks. So the idea of running a race around the park was very attractive to him. But we did find him quite easy to talk to, if a little cagey. And although he wouldn't tell us exactly what Wandsworth had been given, we then later discovered it was 5 times what Wandsworth had told us it was. Later, all we can say is that Agag was a complete gent, and we're very grateful to him. I don't know what the others are going to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're not against my business interests. The NAMBY was a pretty good description of his initial reaction to the protests that we were planning to organize. It had obviously cost him quite a lot to negotiate with the council, to get agreement, to have the race in the park. And he was obviously not pleased that a bunch of local residents were trying to put a spoke in the wheels. But unlike the council, he certainly was prepared to listen to us. He understood what it was that we were saying and that we were clearly sincere. I think he was prepared to strike a deal eventually, out of straight business reasons, that he didn't want us demonstrating against his sponsors when the Formula E was taking place. He's a businessman, as Susan said, and that would not have been good for the brand because the brand was being sold as a green brand and he wanted it to remain that way. So I don't think any of us had any illusions about where he was coming from. But once he realized that actually we were not 2 men and a dog, we were a well-organized and fairly numerous protest group, and we would do everything we could to raise the stakes during Formula E. He realized that the game was up, and he behaved in a extremely gentlemanly kind of way. So, I mean, ultimately, we knew we were up against it because he really wanted to be there, and it had cost him quite a lot in terms of time and effort in order to get there. But it was clearly not sustainable from a business point of view. and that was why he decided to move on.
I think you've got to, I wouldn't use the word admire, but I mean, he's a good businessman. I mean, after we managed to stop him coming back to the park, he got virtually all the major manufacturers in the world to get involved. And then he's obviously gone on with, I think, the same mindset, I've got to say, and now got electric SUVs racing through some of the world's sort of most, rugged beauty spots across the world. And it's a similar sort of mindset. And, you know, he's been very successful at attracting people. I don't think he had a lot of empathy. I don't think he saw it through our eyes. I didn't actually speak to him myself, which is probably quite a good thing from his point of view. I think he's a good businessman, and I think the fact is he did listen to us, and, you know, it made it possible to get a result. So, you know, when I see the different things he's doing now, I don't wish anything negative on him at all. Just quite interesting to follow someone we got involved with.
And what Laurence is speaking about there is, of course, the series known as Extreme E, which is, like you say, is off-road electric SUVs in these sort of somewhat remote, obviously remote being as in not in the middle of London and like a Formula E is, of course. So it's a very different series with a different purpose, but certainly interesting. We have talked about it on the channel before, so thanks, Laurence. That's a great cross promotion. I want to ask a bit about the deal. I want to ask you all, how hard was it to keep the deal a secret, not just from me, but from everyone, essentially, including the council, most importantly? And how satisfying was it when eventually you had to go public on it, and it was obviously too late at that point for the council to intervene and, you know, stop the deal you did with Formula E?
I mean, I heard from our solicitors there was an awful row going on when he'd signed this contract with us. We didn't hear anything more. Everybody was very discreet. And obviously, if he'd mentioned it to the council, you know, that he was signing this contract, he might have had difficulties himself. So we did keep it quiet until we were able to tell people that we'd won, if that's the word. And I think it was just a sigh of relief at the end. And we were going to have a party, but it was the day after the referendum, and there was our community centre was flooded, so we had to call it off.
I think it was relatively easy to keep our counsel. Alejandro Agag had made it clear that he wanted this to be a confidential arrangement until he'd spoken to the council about it and had, in a sense, made his peace with them. And that seemed to us to be a perfectly reasonable request. So we were prepared to keep the fact that we'd arrived at this arrangement, that he wasn't going to come back, to ourselves until he felt that it was something he wanted to go public on. And that seemed to us to be fine. I think that we did have an influence on London-wide campaigning on green spaces, as I've said. I don't think we've had any influence at all on Wandsworth Council. Wandsworth Council is every bit as determined to turn the park into a milk cow for revenue as it ever has been. And ever since the lockdown has started to ease, we've noticed an expansion of events, an excessive noise, obviously a huge amount of litter, and a seeming lack of desire on Wandsworth Council's part at all to really maintain the park as a place of quiet, peace and relaxation. So we envisage that we're going to be keeping pretty active ourselves on these issues for some time to come, which is a great shame, because I don't think Wandsworth Council itself has learnt anything at all from the Formula E experience.
I would add to that it was the Labour Party on the council that pushed the other side, kicking and screaming, to declare a climate emergency. Since when the councillors made great shakes to show how green they are, but they aren't. And they're probably one of the least green councils in London, if not in the UK. So they haven't learnt a thing.
This is just my fault for trying to end on a positive note.
I was going to volunteer a positive ending. I think Battersea Park Action Group was absolutely astonishing. It was people who probably, honestly, I mean, I love these two, but we probably wouldn't have really come together, or all of us wouldn't have, we were all completely different people in completely different professions. We came together, we got things done. Everyone worked out who had the legal skills, who had the environmental skills, who had the people skills, who had the web skills. We worked together. I've got to be honest, the criticism we got from other people, it was like at Millwall Football Club, they've got a song, which I'm going to badly paraphrase, but it's "We're Millwall, no one likes it, and we don't care." And we just carried on, united by love of the park. And we carried on and we carried on. We had some terrible dark nights when we thought we weren't going to win. And then we found, if you like, the sweet spot. We found that if we talked to Agag and then we talked to the sponsors, we'd succeed. And then we did succeed. There was a tiny bit of a drink up by the Peace Pagoda that Susan and Paul couldn't get to, and that was it. And the group is that we're there. We're like the Knights of the Round Table. If the park is threatened, we'll come again. But it was absolutely, honestly, it was absolutely astonishing to be a part of, and we won.
Absolutely, it was a compromise in the end because they did have to let the final race go in, but you did achieve what you set out to do. And to end, I would just say
that I see you guys not just as people in a story that I had to write years ago, but as genuine friends over the years.
And you showed me a lot of kindness when I walked into that meeting one day. Didn't know what the hell was going to happen, and it all turned out for the best, I think. And I've always felt, even after everything ended, I've always felt a huge responsibility telling your story, because it's not just the story of the park, it's a story, like Laurence says, of all these different people coming together from different walks. I don't think I would have met you guys if it wasn't for the Formula E race being there, bizarrely. So even years later, I still feel a responsibility to look at the impact and the legacy that Formula E's had there, and to tell your story your way and the right way, I think. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and thank you, of course, to those listening, if you are watching. So thanks very much, and that's all I have to say. So goodbye.
Thank you.
Fine. Cheerio.